Welcome to the Dirt on the Past,
the Museum Edition,
a YouTube and podcast program of the Extreme History Project, which explores ancient and historical topics relating to artifact collections from the Museum of the Rockies right here in Bozeman, Montana.
At Extreme History, we explore the good, the bad, and the ugly about our human past because, let's face it, history isn't pretty. But it's so important to know because it's at the very thing that has led us to the most critical concerns in the present.
So join me, Nancy Mahoney,
and me, Crystal Alegria,
as we talk to archaeologists and historians who have been digging in the dirt
and in the archives
and in museum collections to uncover fascinating histories that are relevant to today's issues
and can help us move forward with a deeper understanding of the past.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we're co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. And this week we are at the Museum of the Rockies E.L. Wiegand Digital Learning Studio with our guest, Betsy Gaines Quammen.
Hello.
Yeah, we may have had her. I know. We've had her once before, and we're so excited to have her back. If you haven't already heard, we're also excited that we are doing this collaboration with the Museum of the Rockies here in Bozeman, Montana, to bring you a new version of the podcast called The Dirt on the Past.
The Museum Edition.
Okay, a little lag there. I know.
I'll get it.
These podcasts are going to be different only in the sense that we're in this amazing studio, and we will have a video that will show up on either YouTube or Facebook feed. So you'll be able to listen to us in the normal way, but you can also see who we're talking to and see if we have artifacts, which today we don't, but you still get to see our lovely guest. So today we welcome Betsy Gaines Quammen to talk about her new book, True West, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America. Welcome, Betsy. We're so happy to have you here.
I am so happy to be here. I love this space and I love you guys.
Yeah,
so we're going to have fun.
I know. We're going to have a great time.
Fantastic.
And we've done a podcast with you before, Betsy. I think that's maybe been a year or two ago now that we did with your first book, American Zion. So if folks haven't listened to that podcast, they should go back in our archives and find that one and listen to that one.
Definitely. That was a good one.
Yeah.
So we like to start off by telling our listeners and viewers a little bit about our guest. So Dr. Betsy Gaines Quammen is a historian and writer. She received a PhD in environmental history from Montana State University, where she studied religion, history, and the philosophy of science. Her dissertation focused on Mormon history and the roots of armed public land conflicts occurring in the Western United States. Betsy examines the intersection of extremism, public lands, wildlife, and other issues that divide Western communities. She's the author of American Zion, Cliven Bundy, God, and Public Lands in the West, and her newest book, True West, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America. Betsy lives in Bozeman, Montana, with her husband, writer David Quammen.
Hey.
I know.
And we were just saying before we went on air that David would love the studio here with the dodo and the
Well, maybe we can lure him in and talk about one of his books.
Yeah,
it should be wonderful. Yes.
All right, Betsy. So we always love to start off our conversations asking our guest how they came to the research that they do. And so I just wanted to ask you more about the history of the West and those myths and misconceptions of the West, which of course is a topic of yours, but also really a favorite topic of ours as well. So how did you come to history and becoming a historian and to this field, and what is fascinating to you about the study of history?
That's a really good question because I'm an unlikely participant in all this. I did not seek out to be a historian. In fact, I was working in conservation, and that really was my primary focus. I began through my work in conservation to pay attention to how people viewed landscape. And I actually was working in Mongolia and Bhutan, as well as the West, on various projects, and began to work with religious groups. And by working with religious groups, I started to look at how religious prisms, or the way of seeing things, were really influenced by people's beliefs. And I really wanted to work in Mongolia along these lines in terms of environmental history, ways of seeing landscape, cultural perspectives on landscape. But I didn't speak fluent Mongolian and I couldn't read primary text. So I decided that I would look at LDS, or the Latter-day Saints, the history of the Latter-day Saints and Mormonism, and how that really impacted the way people viewed public lands, looking at the roots of the Sagebrush Rebellion and seeing what kind of influences were layered in there in terms of Latter-day Saint sensibilities, history, ways of seeing. And that's how I wrote American Zion. And in writing American Zion, my first book, which actually was my dissertation at Montana State, I began to see how religious views also layered in with Western mythologies. So I looked at the cowboy myth and I looked at rugged individualism and all the things that we think of, manifest destiny. But I also, with this book, began to look at how lands, the myth of the West as hale and hearty, a salubrious place where people can come and somehow not be impacted by COVID. And so these myths became really, really interesting in terms of understanding the West. And as a historian, again, looking through these prisms, that the way we regard lands through these beliefs, both religious and mythological. And we could get into how those overlay too, but that would be a big conversation.
Right. Longer than we might have today. That's true.
Yes. Back in the so big.
Yeah, this is a great chair, but it does tip easily. I know. I've been in that one too. Yeah. So I'm so interested because I think I share a little bit of kind of an eclectic academic background. And so I often relate a lot to the way you've approached your subjects. So I found your previous book fascinating because there's history in it, but then you're also having present day conversations with people to really understand what is going on with the intertwining of Latter-day Saints understanding of religion and how that is affect all these other ideas about public land in the West and then leads to armed standoffs. So in this case, in True West, I want to ask you, then tell us a little bit of how you first conceived of the idea of what it seems like to me, and I could be wrong, but you're kind of hitting the road, almost doing an ethnography of certain communities in the West, really looking at rural communities. And I come from an anthropological background, and, you know, this participant observation where you're showing up at these red pill events and things like that. You're showing up in communities, but you're talking to people, but then you also are bringing in all of your historical knowledge about the West itself, and then that layer of mythology on the West, because that's almost like a dual history of sort of how these myths started, like a history of a myth, and then the history of what was actually happening in these Western lands. And then you're going out, and really so much of the substance of this book is taking things that historians are familiar with in terms of the history and the mythology, but really saying, how is this operating today? So tell us a little bit about then how you conceived of this, and did it start out as something else and it veered in this direction, or do you see yourself with kind of an anthropological, bent or side to you that maybe began with your first book? Or yeah.
Oh, I mean, I would have to say that I love tangles. I love the idea of things tangling together. I'm very much somebody who likes to understand the story behind the story behind the story behind the story. And that, in addition to the fact that I love talking, I love hanging out with people, I love becoming friends with people, I love relationship building. I'm really sort of people focused. And I should say, I talk about bad guys in this book. I spend time talking about Christian nationalists. Right. I don't like those people. So there are definitely bad guys. Sure. But I really felt like we were getting versions of one another, particularly during COVID when we were all sheltering in place, and we were othering, and we were, sort of marginalizing, and we were getting ever more out of sync with one another, and we were becoming factional. It was really problematic to me. And so I did start with a completely different subject. When I pitched this book, it was going to be anti-science. I want to write a history of America and anti-science.
Because coming out of COVID and thinking about where are people with understanding science, whether it's medical science or whatever else, but I could see how that would be a topic that draws on other things you've done, but comes right out of a COVID situation.
It was crazy because, as I began to see what was happening, I really saw something that was absolutely unprecedented. So I started with anti-science, but then I started to see what was happening with anti-science as a movement. And I'm talking about the anti-vaxxers who began to collaborate with militia, with the patriots, with other, the trumpets, the Trumpism people, the Stop the Steal, the people who believed in QAnon, and which is the, whole idea of deep state and celebrities bathing in blood
and prophecies and Donald Trump and all of that.
That.
Yeah, the old child ring cabal.
Exactly.
People.
And bathing in blood. And it's outrageous. And yet it really took root. And so when I started thinking about anti-science, I saw that it was becoming much bigger than I think I initially conceived of in thinking about this book. And so I start the book with a trip to the museum, a dinosaur museum in Glendive,
which that's is a powerful way to start.
Which is a creation museum. And I talk about how friendly the director is. Absolutely lovely man. But how that idea of biblical literalism is so dangerous. And I had no idea that by the time the book came out, we would have a Speaker of the House who believed that dinosaurs and humans walked on Earth at the same time. So what I was trying to do was unpack these ideas, unpack these myths, and make them, to show how they connected to what we're doing right now and how we're relating to each other right now and what's happening to our communities, our region, and our country. Because one of the things I talk about in this book is that Western mythology is foundational to the way Americans see themselves, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, definitely. And, kind of going back to your book and talking about how you kind of unpacked all these things that you just spoke about, you really started the reader off in a museum. And it's kind of appropriate that we're sitting in a museum right now.
Yes.
Museum is a big theme in here. But you talk about kind of those myths of the American West. And the way you do that is through this imagined museums of myths as you go through the book. And so I love that, how you did that. And we won't today we won't have time to discuss, of course, all the myths that you talk about in the book. But I want to start with one of the big myths of the West that we encounter. And that's the idea that this place, the West, was empty prior to settlement in the 1860s by non-native people. And this myth that no one lived on this land or used this land, and it was just there available for the taking. And what that means by the taking is the idea that it was just available for monetization. And that's in the form of agriculture, that's in the form of extractive industries, and that's in the form of all these different ways that money is made from this land, from this landscape. And, we have a really good, I think it's I don't know if it's still our tagline for the state of Montana, but we're called the treasure state. And that really pretty much sums it up.
Right.
People were here to take the treasure and take it out of this place and use it for their own personal gain. And even our town founder, John Bozeman, said of the settlement that Bozeman is, quote, standing right at the gate of the mountains, ready to swallow up all the tenderfeet that would reach the territory from the east with their golden fleeces to be taken care of. So, that's right from the mouth of John Bozeman himself. Mm-hmm. So can you speak a little bit to this, Betsy, and this idea that you really talked about in the book?
Yeah, this is something that I think we've seen. It's cyclical. When we had this idea of the West, the last place settled by Europeans, there was this idea that you could go out and have this wonderful farm, or log these virgin forests, or mine for gold that would sort of pour from streams in the mountains, and that there was no recognition that this was indigenous land. I mean, this is unceded indigenous land, and this land, this West, was not unpeopled. It was dispossessed. And so we do, for whatever reason, as Americans, have work to do in recognizing that. And I think that what I talk about, which is really thrilling, is this ongoing Native resistance to this idea. And I talk quite a bit about that, which is thrilling. And so we do, in looking at this place, we need to recognize that this is a place of vital cultures that have been here since time immemorial. And so that's one of the biggest myths I want to bust. But this idea of the commodification of the West, of going out and again profiting from it. It's not a good relationship. It's not a sustainable relationship. We still have this idea of the never-ending frontier and endless resources that somehow there's just never an end to what we can consume and take. And we continue to see boom and bust cycles that impact communities. We continue to see the wealthy encroaching into some of our last really important habitats. We continue to see people moving in here, looking at the show Yellowstone, that soapy Kevin Costner show, thinking,
never seen it. I know.
You know what?
Yeah.
I had to see it. I had to see it just because I talk about it. But
of course. No, it's all right.
Oh my gosh, I am not a fan at all. It's really, I mean, I think watching it, why would you move to Montana if that's the way you see Montana?
Yeah, and that's what is really strange to me, is that they see this show, which is full of murder and greed and all these things, and then you want to go to a place where all that happens. Why would you want to do that?
It's really strange, and yet it has been a phenomenon. I think I read recently that the population of Bozeman has grown 17% in the last 3 years. Wow. Part of that is due to Yellowstone.
COVID and Yellowstone. It's the terrible kind of coincidence of those two things, I think. Yeah.
COVID refugees. Right. Yeah. Yep. Kevin Costner.
Yes, exactly.
When we do our walking tours, we often have people, we'll say, where are you from? And why did you come? Why are you visiting Montana? Or what are you doing? Are you going to Yellowstone National Park? Or, and they say, well, we saw Yellowstone and we just wanted to come visit Montana because of that. So it's really interesting. We get a lot of Yellowstone tourism. From the show.
And I talked to folks, or rather real estate agents, who said Yellowstone was a huge part of their business. That show, people would buy
the sight unseen. That's what's crazy.
Which is, and in a way I kind of understand it, because during COVID you had people who were locked up in perhaps in areas with more stringent restrictions,
right? And
all of a sudden you saw this television show with like wide open vistas and people riding horses, and sort of this myth of unbridled liberty, and they think, gosh, Montana's where I should be. So COVID was a huge catalyst in making Yellowstone so popular, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right.
I got to episode 2.
Yeah. Did you see the episode where they go on a date? I don't even remember the characters. The main woman and one of the main guys, and they go on a date in a pickup truck to watch a wolf eat an elk. And they pull up right in front of the wolves as the wolves eat the elk. Like, that's what we do in Montana. Big date night.
Bananas.
It's just crazy. But, that's just, for me, and really, thinking about the Yellowstone show versus A River Runs Through It, that was filmed here 31 years ago now, and we had a lot of tourism from that, and we had a lot of people move here from that. But I can see that much more than the show Yellowstone, because A River Runs Through It was it was about fishing. It was about this lifestyle. It was very different than the family that is portrayed in Yellowstone. The two families are very distinct and very different. So
I do have a funny story about that. So Chris Latre, who we were talking about earlier, he's a Montana poet laureate, and he's also coming out with his book, Becoming Little Shell. His tribe was just recognized a few years ago.
Right.
He's co-editing an anthology, a Montana anthology with Kathleen McLaughlin, who wrote, she's from Butte. She wrote Blood Money about people who sell their plasma to stretch their paycheck. Yes. She's fantastic. They both are wonderful. And they're coming out with this anthology about real Montana. And they asked me to write a chapter about how odious fly fishing literature is and how breathy and awful. And so I get to write, and it's not everybody, and I don't want to put off those who are just huge fans. My husband happened to be a fly fishing guide while he was getting, an aspiring writer, and he actually wrote some really beautiful fly fishing literature. But I am so excited to write about the self-importance of fly fishing literature. And so I that's gonna be so fun. Oh my gosh. I have found some doozies.
Oh, I bet.
And it is nothing like it used to be, from what I hear too. I mean, my husband used to come up when he was much younger, before we lived here, to fly fish, and what you would catch then, and how there was so much less pressure on the fish. Now with rising temperatures, but also so many people, he doesn't really enjoy fly fishing like he used to. It's really changed.
Well, you go to the Madison during a hatch and it's wall-to-wall people. I mean, it's absolutely nuts. Yes. So not to say that we don't like people visiting Montana.
No, we love it.
It just needs to be reconsidered, and it needs to be more sustainable, because Montana's popularity is really hurting it.
Yeah, we love to see people come to Montana and visit in a responsible way.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned in the book, the Montana Tourism Office is really promoting that responsible tourism when people come to Montana.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you are really talking about a whole new myth that's layering on a foundation of other myths. So this Yellowstone series, this show is layered upon these myths about these open lands, these wilderness lands, these cowboy myths, these bootstrap myths. It's fascinating.
These playgrounds.
And playgrounds for the wealthy, this and that, but how and what you can get away with and what you can do, and some of it's quite ugly, but people find it fascinating and kind of want a piece of that. And again, it's kind of this false sense of what is and what was that is still propelling people to kind of act in certain ways, which I think is fascinating. So you've definitely pulled on that in there. And I want to ask, because we're talking about empty landscapes and wilderness, and one of the things that has always brought people to Montana is our national parks, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and these were established quite a ways back. But one of the chapters of the book, you really talk a lot about Escalante, and you talk about the town around there, and you talk about different perspectives that people in that town and around that town had about the establishment of it, and then now currently reacting to the impact. So talk a little bit about that, and how the actual designation of the monument, why that was polarizing, and then how the town today feels about it.
Right. That's a really interesting chapter for me, for a researcher, because I talk to so many people with so many different points of view. It's very polarizing in that town. The monument's very polarizing. Right. And so you have some people who are huge, huge supporters, and some people who are livid still, even though it was designated in 1996.
And just remind people, before it was a national monument, before it was designated under the Clinton administration, what was all that land, and how was it used? Bureau of Land, and so it was much more accessible to people to use in certain ways as BLM land.
Well, it was. That's a really good question.
I mean, it doesn't look like land I'd want to graze my cattle on.
That's
what's so strange,
And they didn't say you couldn't graze cattle. There are very few allotments. I'm forgetting exactly how many, but it's not very many.
Right.
I think the controversy was that they wanted to mine the Kaparowitz Plateau, and there were all these promises of jobs that with coal mining, but it wasn't at the end of the day financially feasible. It was going to cost way more to do mitigation than it was to extract the coal. So there were a lot of people who were really excited about the idea of jobs, which makes sense.
Sure.
But there were a lot of, sort of really actually a lot of misinformation around it, because it was never going to be this like wonderful job creating opportunity. It was going to have grave environmental impacts, and it was going to be another situation of boom and bust.
Right.
That said, there's been this huge sort of rally behind tourist jobs, but those are seasonal, and those are really hard to raise families.
Right.
And these extractive industries, mining, logging, grazing in the area, have cachet because they're traditional jobs that that used to pay well.
They used to pay well.
Right. And so that is really a controversy. I loved talking to one of the characters there, a woman named Candy DeGraw, who grew up in a Mormon family. It's actually a little ways away, but it's in southern Utah, and it has very similar culture. But she talks about the fact that the conservationists who came in and really loved the idea of the monument were hugely condescending to the local people. And they were basically like, we know how to use this land better than you. And so the local people were offended by that and dug in. It was not a good strategy for getting people all on the same page. And so she talked a lot about that and the fact that people were unwilling to even be friends with local LDS people, that there was, I mean, she was funny. She said, these people think they're so open-minded, the conservationists who came here, but they're not even willing to be friends with people with a different religious perspective, which I thought was really interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it was. And then I ended up, the town visit ended up being fascinating because I ended up meeting with one of these guys that, because of Black Lives Matter, created he wouldn't let me call it a militia.
I remember that part in the book. You're like, militia? And he's like, well, not really.
This is a
guard or something.
It's called the Escalante Guard, protecting their community. And it turned out that they were protecting their community from Antifa, which was the
that's a hot spot right there in Escalante for Antifa, right? They all just hunker down there, and I'm totally kidding. They do not. Okay, but but it's an imagined fear.
It's an imagined fear that came out of a really sort of a loose coalition of people in the Pacific Northwest. It actually it started in Minnesota, and then it was in the Pacific Northwest, and there were clashes during the Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter, protests. But the thing that I really do in this book is I look at how all the things that happened to us during those years of those convulsive years, and how they played out in the West, what they did to communities, and how they really did wrap around various mythologies and various sorts of misinformation. So this is a book about everything, including taking what was happening in the West all the way to January 6th and the patriot movement here, the militia movement here, armed protests here, going to the Capitol during the insurrection.
Because a lot of people from this region not only from Montana, but from all the regions around and the states around, a lot of them ended up at the Capitol on January 6th.
Well, one in particular was Stuart Rhodes, who was the co-founder of the Oath Keepers.
Yes, talk a lot about him.
With his wife, Tasha Adams, who lives in Eureka, Montana. She's since left the movement. She has since divorced Stuart Rhodes. And I will tell you, she is one of the toughest, smartest, funniest people I have ever met. And one of my favorite things about writing this book is meeting Tasha Adams, who met Stuart Rhodes as a very young woman, was severely manipulated, was abused. Their kids were abused. He was a bad guy. And again, he cut his teeth in the West. He grew up in Las Vegas, but he was very involved with the Bundy family in Clark County, Nevada, the whole Battle of Bunkerville, which was the armed standoff in 2014, and that really put wind in his sails as well as money in his coffers.
Right.
And then there he was, in October of 2020, he was talking about the fact that the election was going to be stolen. And so it was fascinating as I was writing this book to anticipate what was going to happen when, as we said at the beginning of the interview, the anti-vaxxers and and Stuart Rose and the militia and the constitutional sheriffs and people who believed in QAnon and lizard people who took over the world were all together at the Red Pill Expo that you mentioned at the very beginning. This idea of that conspiracy theorists believe that if you take the red pill, you're going to see everything the way Keanu Reeves saw it in Matrix.
Yes.
But I loved, Betsy, how you really took those myths back to their origin stories too. And really, it really helped me better understand kind of where we're at today based on the history that you told, and kind of teased out all those different lines that kind of came together at this time in 2020, where there was just kind of this explosion of all this happening. And it makes sense. It makes so much more sense on why, not that any of it is good, but it makes sense as to why a lot of this stuff happened and why ultimately January 6th happened. And so just to better understand how those players came together and those movements and those different groups came together was
well, I love
really
the phrase
to me to understand,
peeing on the anthill, because
I
really felt like it's everything you're talking about is that guy saying it's like there's an anthill, and what Trump did was just pee all over. There's all this fomenting, all this other weird stuff going on, all these other threads of conspiracies, and in his tenure as president, or even leading up to it, politically with this huge megaphone, could just stoke all of those things and himself bring them together and make that entanglement happen in people's minds, so that they these things were heaped on each other. So I want to.
That was Jay Pounder, who was part of. He wrote a book called The Red Pill, and he's since left the movement. But he was very involved with the militia movement and Christian nationalism, and the whole idea of front lines and homelands in the Idaho Panhandle, which I write about again, based on mythology. But he's the one who told me that he was absolutely freaked out by what he saw Trump doing to his movement. And that's when he said, I'm out of here.
Now, this brings me to a point, because this is one of the questions Crystal and I were talking about just before, is throughout your book, and you talk about there are bad guys out there. Other than that, you really enjoyed talking and meeting with people. So I want to ask you sort of what your thoughts are on how somebody becomes what we would say across that line of truly radicalized or fanatical. So we have somebody who was down that path, but then sees what Trump's doing, and Jay's like, no, I'm gonna pull myself back. So he hadn't tipped over beyond coming back. But I feel that there were people in this book, people that you met, people that we know of, who that's it. They're kind of gone down a path, and there's no sitting down across a cup of coffee at a diner and hearing. There's no listening on their part anymore. There's just spewing. And am I wrong, or how do you think someone gets into that position? Because I feel like going forward, I think what you're advocating for is, listening and talking to each other and not demonizing. But there's some people who I sense you might just be wasting your efforts. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, first of all, there are truly bad people. I mean, that are not only have ugly racist ideas, but they're making money on people's fear, and they're making money on spewing really ugly stuff. And so there's this kind of click baity thing going on. There's also people who are gaining power, keeping us polarized, and you can watch the way people campaign, politicians, and how they're othering, dehumanizing. We need to pay attention to that, because it's easy to fall into traps, and that's for anybody. To fall into these traps that create hate. And so I think that's really important. But what I was seeing is that there are and I spent a lot of time in rural communities, although, you know, urban communities can be just as vulnerable, but rural communities that are economically hamstrung, like that they are struggling, people want to have a bad guy, and people want to be, they're angry, and they feel neglected and left behind and not listened to, and they become targets for people who are, you know, radicalizing people. And so, you know, Ammon Bundy, and I talked to him at the beginning of COVID. He created an organization called People's Rights Network, which was a vigilante neighborhood watch, and I'm doing air quotes, where people don't trust the government, don't trust your police. If something happens, let's all show up and we can bring arms. And so I don't know if you recall this, but it was People's Right Network that were in front of Matt Kelly's house.
And you put that in the book, and I remember thinking, because I had been hearing all about that, and it was amazing to hear how the community itself went to such great lengths. And who was it that had parked outside? They had a trailer that was blaring something super annoying constantly, so that it
Viagra ads and a fart machine.
And the fart machine. And I was like, brilliant. Like
and Matt Kelly, it was the health supervisor for Gallatin County.
Absolutely.
And he lives right here in Bozeman. And no, the neighbors rallied. They were hilarious.
And this is during COVID.
Viagra.
Because these were other people coming from other places wanting to stand out there, and he has kids. It's scary, you know, you got to get in and out of your house, and all kinds of things were happening. And then to be able to have the neighborhood be like, we're going to do whatever it takes to, you know, that was nice to see in that case, but not everybody has that.
Well,
you know?
and I think that, and I don't know how to scale this because I really want to think about this, but I found that in communities, I had one man who I love, and you'll have to read about it in the book. It didn't start out that way. It was really jarring to have a conversation with him, but he's in a tiny little town in eastern Montana.
Well, we want to talk about him.
Yeah,
He's in here from Terry. We're talking about lands.
And he said he'd been radicalized. And once there was a conversation, once there was engagement, that really broke down. And so I was very concerned about people in communities susceptible to radicalization, because when you have a community that's hurting economically, that's angry, and that's listening to just earfuls of AM hate radio and conspiracy theories, and seeing that online, or even, you know, Fox News, which is mainstream news, it's important to put face in front of face, you know. It's so important to sit down and talk, because you realize you can get through that pretty quickly in people who have not truly been radicalized. Once they're radicalized, there's a lot. I'm not sure how you get through.
Right.
So do you feel like once you start having a conversation, you can fairly quickly assess if you're talking with somebody who is open to talking, or someone who's been radicalized? Do you feel like, you know, like over a cup of coffee, by the time the coffee's finished, you kind of know if you maybe have a relationship you can continue with this person, or something that you would...
And I have to remember, as a cis white middle-aged lady,
I hear you.
Can go into
exactly.
Totally. And talk to people that other people couldn't.
Yes.
You know, at the beginning of this, I was thinking, you remember when there were all these like Karen-y things happening?
Oh, yes.
There was Black Lives Matter, and people were behaving so badly, and this whole idea of come and get your people, you know, white folks, come and get your people.
Yeah.
This was kind of like me going, okay, I can do that. So I'm going to go and talk to people and just see where they are. And I did, you know, I really found that there was so much common ground. That's not the case always.
Everywhere,
and even if we had very strong political differences, we could find places to agree and common values. And I had Mike Satz say that to me too, who started the Idaho 97%, which was supposed to be, you know, the juxtaposition to the 3%ers and other militia groups. And he was saying, you know, I can go into rural communities and really find common ground. And Mike is Black and Jewish, and he's in Idaho. So, and I think he is absolutely amazing too. But it really goes to show you that being intentionally manipulated to distrust and to not like and to even hate.
Yeah.
And that's being done, that's being foisted on us, and not in every case, but to some degree. And we can get around that if we're willing to get out of our little circles, because we become ever more insulated. So, and it's not healthy, and it's due to like newspapers, local newspapers, public institutions, we weren't hanging out with each other for those years. So we got to figure out ways to get back and engage.
So in your book, you give some ways to do that, kind of through example. And one of the examples is through Lance. How do you say his last name?
Lance Calfell.
And you're wearing his hat.
He got a hold of me this morning to see if I wanted a half of beef.
You don't want it, I'll have it.
Give
him my. I'll give you my contact.
We still have stuff from last year. I mean, my family bought one.
It's a lot to get throrough. I know.
It's a lot. So I was going to tell him that because it is delicious. So he and I we have become such good friends.
That's wonderful. So you talk about this relationship in the book and how you met, and he lives in Terry, Montana, which is a very small town in eastern Montana.
Yeah.
But can you talk about this relationship that you built? And you've mentioned a little bit about it, but kind of talk about how you guys came together and then how this relationship has built over time. And you guys are very at odds politically. I mean, you see things a lot different, but you've been able to figure out a relationship. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because this is a really good example of how people can move forward in discussion when someone doesn't see the same things that they do in a lot of different ways politically.
Yeah, and I think I do want to say that Lance is pretty special. Like he is. Again, I keep going to this idea of being funny. There's something about humor that's just like completely breaks the ice, and he is a stitch.
Yeah.
And so when I sat down with him, he was very angry. I was introduced to him by a friend of a friend, and he was really angry at Democrats. He's really angry at the government. He's really angry at the BLM, and I should say I talk about both BLMs in this the Bureau of Land Management, Black Lives Matter. So in this case it was Bureau of Land Management. He's a public lands rancher, and he and I were having a conversation at breakfast over coffee, and he said he'd been radicalized and he was angry, and I was sort of kind of thinking in my head, like, what does that mean? And and I was sort of preoccupied, and all of a sudden he said, I've said this to you 3 times, are you going to take down my contact information? And then I thought, oh, okay, all right, and I jotted it down, and he invited me to his ranch, and in the meantime he'd asked to read American Zion, which I thought, because it talks about public land ranching in not a very nice light. That said, not all public land ranchers are the Bundys, the family that engaged in the action in 2014 and in 2016 in armed events on public lands, one in Nevada and one in Oregon. Well, he wrote me, we wrote each other, and I have the emails in here. I mean, he's just the best. And I went and visited him, and I've since gone and visited him 3 times. I brought my dad there. My dad, who was a conservative Republican who became a Democrat when he saw what was going on with George Bush, and George Bush Jr.
George Bush Jr.
And he switched parties, and he said, but I gotta take a peace offering. So we brought a picture of, my dad was the president of the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce. I grew up in Ohio and then I moved out west when I was 18. And so we brought a picture of himself, my dad, and Ronald Reagan with their arms around each other. And oh my God, that was such a hit. And it was hilarious. And we had this great dinner. We really don't agree on stuff, but it wasn't that long ago that you could hang out with people that voted differently, and it didn't make
Congressmen are saying this, senators are saying this. Something's fundamentally changed. I want to ask you something specifically about Lance, because you talk about his family. It was his great grandfather that had come out and was able to get land, and they've they weathered, some horrible storms, and there's a very famous one in the late 1800s, and then Dust Bowl eras. And I find it fascinating because I feel like those folks are working very hard, and they take an incredible amount of pride in a very difficult lifestyle. Feeds themselves, it feeds some other people. It doesn't always seem like a good idea to me to be doing it what they're doing, but then they often are taking advantage of huge tract of private land that they were able to access as a white immigrant American or whatever originally, and their ancestor. And then they also, as you mentioned, he's grazing on BLM land, public land. So what is his issue with BLM land and the government when he's benefiting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And
you hear this over and over again, I feel like, from ranchers out in the area.
Yeah. And I do think that there are reasons for being disgruntled that are not quite fair. Because, we know that AUMs, that, the Animal Unit Monthly, which is what they pay per month for a cow calf pair, is I think about $1.30. If you do the same thing on private land, it's $30. So it's a bargain.
It's a bargain.
That said, what is irritating and what I understand is that he will have a relationship with a range conservationist that's a BLM guy. They'll come to an agreement on how to manage the land. He'll reconfigure all his ways of doing things and operating, and then that guy will go to another office, and then a new guy will come in and have a new
and they have to redo it all.
And they have to redo it, and it happens over and over. And so once you establish a relationship with somebody and you move forward on that plan, and then to have somebody just like next year come and do it completely differently, it is.
But that happens whether you're Republican or Democrats are in office. I mean, that has nothing to do with politics. It's government. I get it. But then you're like, he hates the Democrats.
Okay, so
I feel like there's layers here, but it always gets blamed on the Democrats.
And at the time when I sat down with them, the President Biden had just withdrawn the XL pipeline.
And he was very upset about that.
He was very upset about that because he thought that revenue from that was going to go to his school district. And he is a very, very, they need funding. Now,
but there's other ways to get funding.
Well, there's also another side of that story, which is that funding that he anticipated wasn't really going to manifest. So there, and I'm trying to think there. I tell it in here too. His biggest bone to pick was that he was invited to I can't remember what board he's on. He's very involved in any number.
Sounded
of
like it.
Yes. He's
all over.
He's really an exceptional guy. Yeah. And he was invited to go to some sort of federal, farm grazing something. And I if Lance is listening, please forgive me that I don't remember what it was. But he had to go through training in order to understand how to interact with women. Sort of
that's right.
Yeah. And right. How do you? It was
sexual harassment training.
Training. And it just irked him that it was the Clinton administration that asked him to do that.
Of all administrations.
And I say that was kind of legit.
Legit. Yeah. But you can't broad brush a whole party based on that one experience. And the thing is, I feel like there's a lot of people who I meet who they will have one thing they'll point to about a particular party or movement, and they throw the whole baby out with the bathwater because of that one thing. And that's what I don't understand is like, but you never are going to look at anything positive.
And I have to say we're all guilty of that. I mean, I think that we really need to be aware of that because that's kind of a tendency. I mean, we get mad about one thing and all of a sudden we write off that politician or that person.
I would just have to say, I am the one person in my household who doesn't do that.
Good.
And no, it is because but this is being raised and choosing anthropology as a field of study. There's always different worldviews and perspectives. I don't personally do it, but I have to interact with people who do it all the time. So I liked your book, but I get frustrated when people hone in on one thing and then that seems to be their answer to why they believe in this narrow perspective that they do. And I guess I'm just wishing, there's a way through. And why can't we agree that, like, there's plenty of Republicans that are for things and do things, even though I don't consider myself a member of that party. But there's people who have morals and who I respect, less so now than when I was growing up.
Oh, it's gotten way more polarized. And that's what I talk about. I mean, when I'm talking to Lance, one thing that Lance does not like is sidearms. He feels really uncomfortable seeing people with guns.
Well, we all should. And if we don't, then we're in real trouble.
Well, and I think that what I was trying to do is just what you're saying is how do I see all of this here? Yes. And you know what? I would say that he did the same for me. Yeah. I mean, and so that's why we were able to create a relationship. Because what you're saying is extremely problematic. Right. And I was really trying to get to the other side of that. Like, you know what? It's not black and white, guys. It's nuanced.
Never.
Right. And so that's the takeaway of this book. Right. Just what
it's like those arguments where if you get into an argument with your spouse or whoever you're living with, and you didn't do this, and then it becomes you never do that, and then but then you never do that, and it's those things therapists tell you never to do, and I feel like we're doing it on a grand scale as a nation. Yeah, you guys are always this way, you guys never do that, you don't care, and we've put each other in those it's an unwinnable, untenable position, and we only have two parties, and a lot of this stuff is really silly and stupid, and often people weren't intentionally trying to do something harmful. Now, we do have an ugly history in a tremendous amount of ways. We agree on that, in terms of pushing people off the landscape and having our own genocide occur on this landscape. But at this point, it's like you got to move forward. You got to find ways to move forward and stop harping on an imagined mythological past and demonizing someone so another perspective so completely.
And what you say in the book, Betsy, I think is so important, because we have to understand these myths. We have to see them for what they are, and then we have to talk about them, understand them, figure out the histories of them, and then move forward, leaving them in the past, and talking to one another, talking to folks like Lance and all the different people you talk to in the book, and coming to these shared ideas of how we can move forward together in a good way, in a way that isn't polarization, isn't radicalization, and in those different things that you mentioned. And so I love the examples that you use, and I love all the conversations that you have with all people from all backgrounds, from all different walks of life. And I think that to me is such an important thing. And Nancy, I want you to talk a little bit before we wrap up. We're getting to the end of our time, but I wanted you just to talk about your own experience of this in Montana. And because when you did an archaeological project in Judith Gap, Montana, you had a lot of these conversations that were so important. So just talk a little bit about that.
It was very similar, because we were invited to do a field project where there was a bison kill site that had been discovered on this guy's private land, and he had gone to Montana State. I think initially he had wanted a way to make money off it, but then he thought, this thing is just being excavated by my neighbors who are hunting for points. Maybe bring the university in and let them actually discover something about this. So we were brought in to do a field project, and everywhere around it's all private land. And when I went to the State Historic Preservation Office and we were asking for information on what we know about the archaeology, the prehistory of the region from sites that have been recorded, there's nothing, because it's all private land. And so all the surveys get done on BLM land, on forest land, on stuff like that. And in that area, people were like, nope, we don't want archaeologists coming in, because if they find either dinosaurs or archaeology, the government or the Indians are going to take the land back. And so people wouldn't talk about it. They were, there was no information. They didn't want to share. So we went out, we set up a field school, and we invited anyone and everyone who wanted to come out, see the site, see what we were doing, see how we were doing it scientifically. We'd present information. We invited people in, and we had one man who had done a lot of the uncontrolled, mining of the site for points, but we brought him in to talk about what he learned about the site, because he had already opened a big portion of it. And we wanted to at least learn what we could from him. And little by little, by the end of our field season, people were coming up to us, telling us that they have sites on their lands. They'd like to show us, they'd like to talk about it. All of a sudden it broke down, but they wanted to ask me a bunch of questions. They wanted the trust. And I was never going to tell anybody, don't pick up a point, don't do it. We just said, look, all this stuff is coming off of David Bradley's land. All of the stuff we're going to analyze and we're going to give back. It is not ours, it's his. And if he doesn't want it back, maybe there's some sort of community museum, but we're not here to take and not give back. We're here to build. And it was a very different approach. And it made such a difference. And then boom, COVID hit up. But it's right. But but to me, to be able to go out there and spend time and earn people's trust, then they start to be willing to talk to you and trust. And then we start to, because there's this big gaping hole in our understanding about what happened in this huge chunk of Montana, prehistorically, and with just a little bit of opportunity to walk the fields on somebody's property, could fill in a lot of those gaps. So for me, it was very past, but really everything I have to do is taking place in the present. And I'm having to engage with people, and I'm having to mostly just listen and let people ask questions and let people come to know me and trust me, and it was very rewarding because, like you said, I'm not super psyched if somebody wants to just dig up a site on their own land, but that is legal, and I'm not going to sit here and lecture them on it. But I'm going to talk to them about what they could learn if they had an archaeologist come out and scientifically was able to do a proper, research project. So, that's all you can do.
And, I think that's great. I am going to just say just your reaction to Lance and the public land rancher sort of.
I'm just trying to understand it. I know I'm probably coming across as really harsh.
I mention something because this book is meant to have everybody bump into a little bit of edge. It really is. And I want everybody to be able to self-reflect. I had all my characters read all their Lance got to read his chapter, and that Derek, who I talk about in the first chapter, which is a pseudonym, got to read his chapter. Roger Lang, the wolf friendly guy, got to read his chapter. So everybody got to read their chapter, so that I really captured what they, I didn't want to do any gotcha. I wanted to be as subjective as possible, but I have had people come back and say, you're just way too pro rancher in this book. Well, I talk a lot about what ranchers do to wildlife and how, it's really hard on wildlife. And so one of the best compliments I've gotten is that I talked to Lance a couple of months ago, and I just reached out like, how you doing? And he said, I'm fine. I'm finally recovering from reading your book, because he read the whole thing. And meanwhile, so that's going to be edgy for him. There's a lot in here that makes it abundantly clear where I stand politically. Right. But I also got a message from Ijeoma Oluo in Seattle, who wrote, So You Want to Talk About Race? She's a very, very well-regarded, she's actually come to Bozeman, but well-regarded activist who has been very, very successful in her efforts to address race issues. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm really liking this book. And so I thought, if I can have Lance read it and Ijeoma read it, that is what I'm trying to do. It's supposed to go to a broad audience of people. It's going to push people's buttons. It's going to make them say, how could you blah, 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 or whatever. But I want that to be the case. Because the issues push my buttons too.
Yeah.
So
in a way for us to kind of come back together and start talking to each other again, even though we do have buttons pushed, we can still continue those conversations and those relationships, which are so important.
And more than buttons for me, it makes me want to get out there and do more of talking to people and actually listening to, asking questions and then listening.
And listening was a big part of the solution that you mentioned as well.
Yes, absolutely. The program at Boise State called Idaho Listens.
That's
from all backgrounds get together and tell their story. I think it's a fantastic model. Oh, it's so fantastic.
Cool. Yes.
Yeah, but we are winding down.
Okay.
Betsy.
Darn it.
And so
Wow.
what an amazing conversation today. So
again,
yeah,
I know.
Such a good conversation.
So good.
Back?
Yeah.
Of course. You'll be our first three-timer. We'll have to get like a special jacket, like SNL. I know. You'll be our first three-timer. Yay!
Right. We've talked a lot about your book. So now, Betsy, can you tell us where people can get your book?
Yes.
And not just your True West, your new book, but also American Zion.
Yeah, absolutely. You can get it at independent bookstores, which I recommend. You can get it on Libro. You can get American Zion on Libro, which is the audio version.
Nice.
We're working to get True West on the same thing. But and if you absolutely must, you can order on Amazon, or I would prefer you, if you're ordering it, to order it directly from Torrey House Press, which is torreyhousepress.org, I think. Or you can just Google Torrey House Press, and you can order it directly from the publishing company there. So it's available everywhere.
All right.
That's great.
Good.
That's great.
Well,
yay.
Go out and get it, everybody.
I know. So we're just going to say thank you to you, Betsy, and thanks to all our listeners and maybe viewers out there for joining us today. So if you love this podcast, please tell a friend and make sure to subscribe so it shows up in your podcast feed each week, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. So we want to thank everybody for either tuning in or listening today, and we hope you can join us again to find out more about the dirt on the past.
And we wanted to give a special shout out again to Ashley Hall, who you don't get to really see, but she's there.
Here she comes,
Yay, Ashley.
and she's there, right there.
Thank you so much to Ashley Hall and Chelsea Hogan and all the folks at the Museum of the Rockies for the use of this beautiful studio space. And thank you to Los Alegria for mixing the music. And thanks everyone for joining us today.